The most powerful military genius in Europe is sitting in a muddy tent, staring at a vial of poison. His army is annihilated. His capital is on the brink of falling. He has no allies left. He writes, "To tell truth, I consider everything lost. I will not survive the ruin of my fatherland. Farewell forever." But at the very last second, a messenger bursts in with a dispatch that completely changes the course of the war. That man is Frederick the Great. Most people think global world wars only happen in the 20th century, but that's a myth. You see, the real First World War was actually the 7 Years' War. Give me only 15 minutes and I'll tell you everything about this forgotten global conflict. Let's rewind to the very beginning. Look at this tiny patch of land right here. The Kingdom of Prussia. It's a young kingdom, barely 50 years old. Nobody expected them to have the sheer audacity to march in and snatch up this incredibly wealthy region, Silesia. Austria was absolutely furious and wanted Silesia back. To get it, they did unthinkable. They teamed up with their ultimate arch-nemesis, France. These two empires had been at each other's throats for 300 years, fighting for European supremacy. Russia didn't think twice and jumped into this mega alliance too. They had absolutely no intention of letting some upstart kingdom like Prussia dictate the balance of power in Europe. Meanwhile, Britain has its own agenda. They want to be the undisputed heavyweight champion of the colonial world, but France is standing right in their way. On top of that, Britain needs to protect Hanover, which France is threatening to invade. So, having just lost their traditional ally in Austria, Britain decided to shake hands with Prussia. The leader of Prussia, Frederick II, was no fool. He knew exactly what was brewing. He saw this massive coalition forming against him, an alliance he mockingly called the coalition of the three petticoats. So, backed by the British, he makes a bold choice. He decides to strike first. But while Europe was busy drawing lines on maps, the shooting had already started in America. And the man who pulled the trigger was George Washington. Yes, that George Washington who would later become the first president of the United States. Deep in the Ohio wilderness, Washington's militia, along with his Native American allies, ambushed a small French patrol. In a brief, chaotic skirmish, a French officer named Joseph Coulon de Joinville was killed. The French was absolutely outraged. They claimed Joinville was on a peaceful diplomatic mission and branded Washington a cold-blooded murderer. In retaliation, they surrounded Washington at a hastily built stockade. Here, Washington suffered the only surrender of his entire military career. Not knowing a word of French, he blindly signed a capitulation document, officially confessing to the assassination of Joinville. By 1755, the board was set. France controlled a massive amount of territory and had secured far more Native American allies. But Britain had a crushing demographic advantage. Roughly 2 million colonists, compared to a mere 60,000 French settlers. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, India was being torn apart by a corporate war. The private armies of the rival East India companies were actively helping the mighty Mughal Empire shatter to pieces. Local princes were at each other's throats, while European executives acted as puppet masters, funding rival claims to the throne. Then the powder keg exploded. The Nawab of Bengal, a French ally, overran the British fort in Calcutta. He crammed 146 British prisoners into a tiny dungeon barely 14 by 18 feet in the sweltering 104-degree heat. By morning, only 23 people walked out alive. Some survived only by drinking their own sweat. This horrifying tragedy became infamous as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The British public was absolutely enraged. The press went into absolute frenzy. In response, Britain dispatched their avenger to India, a ruthless corporal commander named Robert Clive. Let's back to our main character. August 1756. He strikes first. Without even bothering to declare war, he invades Saxony. And he doesn't just occupy the land, he forcefully absorbs the entire military machine into his own army. Austria and her allies were absolutely furious. But they had one comforting thought. Prussia was in a completely desperate situation. Look at the board. It's Prussia against half the world. France, Austria, Russia, Sweden and Saxony. Prussia's only backup is Britain, throwing them cash and naval support. The coalition has over 400,000 troops. Frederick had barely 250,000. But Prussia doesn't flinch. They are ready to fight to the bitter end. Exact a year after taking Saxony, a catastrophic defeat shattered the myth of Frederick's invincibility. But to understand why he fell, we first need to understand the superpowers that made him invincible in the first place. Imagine you weigh 130 pounds and you're sparring with a 260-pound giant. If you trade blows head on, you'll be crushed. What does a smart fighter do? He fakes a jab, steps to the side, and puts his entire body weight into one devastating liver punch. Frederick is that lightweight fighter. He was almost always outnumbered. Instead of lining up his troops parallel to the enemy like every other general of his time, he broke the rules. First, he would send a weak fraction of his army straight at the enemy face. The enemy would think, aha, a frontal assault, and focus all their attention there. But meanwhile, Frederick's main strike force, hiding behind hills and trees, would sprint around the enemy flank. At the perfect moment, the Prussians would smash into the very edge of the enemy line with their entire mass. He created absolute superiority in one single spot. Wait, hold on. This is a YouTube channel that makes history genuinely exciting, not some boring textbook lectures for nerds. Could you please hit that subscribe button and leave a like? It really helps us grow and keep making these videos. Alright, back to the disaster. Frederick wanted to end the war with one knockout blow. The Austrian army under Marshal Daun was waiting for him near Kolin. Frederick spotted them and decided to use his favorite move, the oblique order, flank attack. But he got cocky. Prussia rushed it without proper reconnaissance. The faint oblique order broke down into a messy, disorganized frontal assault against fortified hills. Marshal Daun met the chaotic Prussian lines with a wall of lead. Seeing his allied soldiers retreating in a blind panic, Frederick himself rode out to face the fleeing men, screaming, "Dogs, do you want to live forever?" But even his absolute fury wasn't enough. Prussia lost 14,000 men, nearly half their army. That same year, the Russian steamroller entered the war, invaded East Prussia and laid in heavy, brutal blows. But Frederick learned from his mistakes, and that reality check led to his legendary masterclasses at Rosbach against French and Lucerne against the Austrians. In both battles, Frederick was outnumbered 2-1, but through sheer cunning and a perfect oblique order, he completely outplayed them both. This became such a massive triumph for Frederick the Great that people were actually buying his portraits in Paris, the capital of his mortal enemy. Why? Because the French intellectuals despised their own corrupt royal court and the incompetent generals appointed by the king's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. In fact, Voltaire, one of the greatest French philosophers, was pen pals with Frederick. Because Frederick wasn't just a warlord, he was the philosopher king. It was the ultimate victory of mind and tactics over sheer mass. But fast forward to 1759, and Frederick hits rock bottom. He relied on his luck, neglected his scouting again, and completely misjudged the enemy. At the bloodbath of Kunersdorf, out of 50,000 strong army, Frederick was left with barely 3,000 men. The rest were dead, wounded, or had scattered to the winds. He falls into a deep depression, losing all hope. But then, the Russian commander General Saltykov looks at the situation and snaps at his allies. "Hey Austrians, don't you think you are getting free ride on our backs? Why the hell aren't you even sending us a single division?" The Austrians, on the other hand, were terrified that Russia was getting too powerful in Europe. Because of this toxic paranoia, the two victorious army had a massive falling out and actually retreated from Berlin. Frederick finds out and realizes he's been saved by what he called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. He bought himself time to rebuild. But remember the intro of this video? That wasn't about this battle. The absolute darkest, most terrifying moment of the war is still waiting for Frederick. Britain was dreaming of total domination in North America, but to pull it off, they need a killer strategy. Enters the British mastermind, William Pitt the Elder. He comes up with a brilliantly simple plan. We must cut France off from its colonies, starve them out, and they won't be able to fight back. The Royal Navy throws up a massive blockade. Without supplies from France, the Native Americans allies stop getting their gunpowder and trade gifts, and they simply walk away, leaving the French exposed. Then comes the night of September 13, 1759. In a daring stealth operation, the British find a narrow, hidden god path up a sheer cliff face and literally drag their cannons up in the pitch dark. When the French wake up the next morning, they look out and see a terrifying sight. A solid wall of redcoats lined up right outside their city walls. The French panic and launch a hasty attack, completely underestimated British discipline. The British commander General James Wolfe is killed in the brutal firefight, but the redcoats win the day, finally cementing British dominance over Canada. Meanwhile, on the exact opposite side of the planet, the Asian theater is decided by one defining moment: the Battle of Plessy in 1757. This battle changed everything. Robert Clive leads a tiny force of just 3,000 British troops. Facing him is a French-backed Nawab of Bengal with a monstrous army, 50,000 soldiers, 53 heavy cannons, and actual war elephants. Right before the clash, a massive monsoon downpour hits. The British, being seasoned professionals, quickly throw traps over their gunpowder. The Nawab's forces and their French allies don't. Their powder is completely soaked. When the rain stops, the Nawab's army charges in, assuming the British guns are just as useless. Big mistake. The British open up with a devastating point-blank barrage of grape shot. But here is the real kicker. The Nawab's top general, Mir Jafar, just stands there and watches his army just slaughtered. Why? Because Clive had already bought him off in secret, promising to make him the new puppet ruler. Thanks to a simple rainstorm and a fat bribe, Britain conquered the wealthiest region in India. With Bengal secured, it was only a matter of time before Britain swallowed the rest of the Indian subcontinent whole. To tell truth, I consider everything lost. I will not survive the ruin of my fatherland. Farewell forever. Frederick is inches away from drinking the poison he always carries in his pocket. Prussia is literally on the verge of being whipped off the map. Resources are completely drained. No money, no men left, and Britain has just got off their financial subsidies. Prussia was down to its final weeks. By all historical logic, this should have been the end. But fate had a different script. On January 5th, 1762, the Russian Empress Elizabeth suddenly dies. This is a woman who despised Frederick and swore to keep fighting until he was utterly destroyed. Her nephew, Peter III, takes the throne, and in a massive plot twist, he was a fanatical fanboy of Frederick. He considered the Prussian king his absolutely idol and mentor. Without a second thought, Peter pulls off a mind-blowing diplomatic somersault. He doesn't just pull Russia out the war, he hands back every single inch of conquered Prussian territory and sides a full-blown alliance with Frederick. Prussia's deadliest enemy instantly transforms into its best friend. Frederick is thrilled. He pivots all his forces to focus entirely on the Austrians, aiming to end the war on honorable terms. But Peter's hasty and overly generous fanboying actually cost him his throne. He gets overthrown and replaced by his own wife, the soon-to-be legendary Catherine the Great. Frederick launches an attack on the Austrians, but by this time, the coup in Russia is already complete. The Russian corps commanded by General Chernyshев gets strict orders from the new empress to pack up and march home immediately. But it turns out Frederick isn't just a military genius, he's a master diplomat. He manages to persuade Chernyshев to stay and just stand there, to look intimidating. And you know what? It actually worked. The Austrians, seeing those Russian uniforms holding the line, completely panicked and backed off. Prussia won the day thanks to the ultimate, genius-level military bluff. In 1762, Spain decided to jump into the war on French's side, but it was way too late, and honestly, an incredibly stupid move. Riding a massive adrenaline high from their previous victories, the British sailed over and captured Havana, Cuba, a mega fortress that the entire world thought was completely impregnable. But the British juggernaut wasn't stopping there. Spain also owned the Philippines Philippines. A British fleet sailed straight from India all the way to Manila. When the British warships appeared on the horizon, the Spanish garrison was so completely isolated from Europe that they didn't even know they were at war with Britain yet. The British essentially just walked in and took it. Spain was utterly humiliated, but guess what? Britain still wasn't done flexing. Later that same year, the Royal Navy tracks down and captures the massive Spanish treasure galleon, the Santísima Trinidad. The cargo? A jaw-dropping 3 million pesos. At this exact moment, Spain deeply regretted ever getting involved in this global bloodbath. So, what was the ultimate grand finale? On February 15, 1763, the Treaty of Hubertsburg was signed between Prussia, Austria and Saxony. And guess what? The borders stayed exactly the same as they were before the war. Zero change on the map. But Prussia gained something far more valuable: absolute respect. Europe finally recognized Prussia as a certified great power. From this moment on, Prussia was a heavyweight contender you had to listen to. Fast forward 100 years, and this exact nation would unite into the mighty German Empire, a story you can actually watch right now on my channel. Meanwhile, France and Great Britain had to resolve their own differences under the 1763 Treaty of Paris. At the negotiated table, France faced a difficult choice. Should it keep Canada, a vast territory where a lucrative fur trade flourished? Or should it keep Guadeloupe and Martinique, two tiny Caribbean islands where slave labor was used to produce sugar? The philosopher Voltaire famously dismissed Canada, calling it just a few arcs of snow. So France chose the sugar. Canada was completely handed over to the British Empire. On top of that, Britain swallowed Bengal, a territory 3 times smaller than France, but easily 10 times wealthier. But victory came at a massive cost. The war had financially crippled Britain. To pay off their crushing war debt, they started aggressively raising taxes on their American colonies. And exactly 13 years later, this exact decision would spark the American Revolutionary War. I've actually got a whole video about that coming out soon on this channel. This has been one of my first deep dives into history like this. If you enjoyed this kind of content and want to see more, please hit that like button. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.